Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. We've got only one more episode to go. In case of those of you who are joining into the series late, you know I watched Succession, which is the ultimate narcissism lab, as it were, and it only keeps getting better. So let's take this episode on, everyone. Only one more after this. So I'm already talking about grief. I'm getting myself ready for that. So let's just sort of start with how do you eulogize a narcissist? Well, we learned that today, and as you can see, it's very complicated. Let's start at the top with Roman, who, like I said, from a depth and a richness of understanding narcissism character, Roman is the one who's bringing all the stops. So where do we open up? We open up with Roman doing his whole grandiose shtick, King Dong, as it were, who is just prancing about his apartment, pretending to do his grandiose eulogy, feels like he's got it all figured out. I mean, again, we talk about stages of grief. He was living in his denial stage. And remember, Roman is that interesting mix of tons of grandiose narcissism, but his vulnerable underbelly is always right there. And his whole thing, I've pre-grieved my father's loss and all of that. We know Roman, number one, the most trauma bonded to dad. Number two, the one most broken. And number three, what we're going to see in this episode, it's actually a masterclass on how that vulnerable narcissism and that lack of capacity to process emotion pops up in this kind of narcissism. In this episode with Roman, it could literally be a clinical teaching class. So we start with grandiose Roman. Then what happens? It comes to the reality. One thing that Roman has not done is process the actual loss of his father. He still lives in this very unprocessed space of denial around the loss of his father. And then somehow the head of steam, the grandiosity of the morning starts to evaporate. He's even acting like, his usual sexual buffoonery in the car with Shiv, gets into the church, starting to fade away. But I have to say, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Ewan, the brothers, his sort of the kid's uncle, but Logan's brother's eulogy in a moment. But that eulogy was so profound. And again, we come back to that in a minute. But we watch Roman go down that absolute roller coaster slide down from that grandiosity to that vulnerable and that overwhelming emotion that we often do see in folks with vulnerable narcissism. And any of you dealing with a vulnerable narcissist will say, oh my gosh, their emotion felt very real. It was very real. And in Roman's case, it was all of that unprocessed grief. It just comes, it's like tons and megatons of water kept behind a dam. That's the emotional expression experience of a narcissistic person. We're going to see a lot of strong emotion from Roman in this particular episode. First, we see the devastating, almost childlike, can't catch his breath kind of crying at the funeral. Obviously, at the end of the episode, we see this absolutely unfettered rage, but none of this emotion is regulated because he's never learned how to put it out there in the right way. And anyone who watches Roman also knows the more nervous he gets, the more he gets into that really sort of bizarrely disturbed sexual talk he always does. I'm going to come back to Ewan in a moment. Let's talk a little bit about Rava and Kendall, right? So Kendall is now showing himself. This really interesting quality to Kendall coming out. Kendall had long ago, sort of in some ways, processed the trauma bonded relationship he had with his dad. He put his father down a long time ago. We see how grief is an incredibly experience. We see how grief is an incredibly different experience for Kendall compared to his siblings. Kendall is on a very different quest. He put dad down a long time ago. He gets up there, and what he basically gives is not a eulogy of his father, but really sort of a kind of a mission and vision speech about the company. And that's really what their father was to him. And in many ways, what you see is now Kendall is slowly but surely kind of taking on more and more of the mantle of his father. But we see that Rava, Kendall's ex-wife, and Kendall get into it. Of course, Kendall's grandiosity, traditionally Kendall's a very vulnerable narcissist. Kendall's grandiosity is now popping up to the surface. And listen, you can't have a narcissist without a narcissistic post-divorce mess. And here she's trying to get her kids out of a city where they're going to be unsafe. They are going to be unsafe. Kendall has been a middling father at best. But what is he doing? The usual posturing. You're not doing this. I'm going to take you back to court. I mean, enough of you have been through that to know how that whole story goes. And I have to say, like, just as a little bit of a aside, one thing I was struck by is the entire city is burning down, so it seems, because of what had happened in the election, of which ATN was sort of kind of pulling the strings. Why would these three be walking around without security? That's just sort of a technical point. But anyhow, now what we see though with Kendall, an interesting thing, again, what we see with people who are primarily vulnerable narcissistic folks, is Kendall's not only experiencing the abandonment by Rava, his ex-wife, and his kids, then the assistant, Jess, is also saying, I'm out. You know, as a woman of color, she really can't get behind this idea of, you know, being involved with this family that really is supporting an overtly racist president. And while to Kendall, it's all business, and to him, Jess is being ridiculous. That entire sequence, you know how on this channel I've talked about Darvo, what every narcissistic person does when they're confronted: deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. Kendall did that exactly as we'd expect. Tell me, Jess, like, no, this isn't the day. And when she finally does, what does he do? He denies, he attacks, reverses victim and offender, and he says to her, nice day to tell me, Jess, after pushing her. That sequence, a narcissistic person pushing someone, tell me, the person saying, no, this isn't the place or time. The narcissistic person pushes, the other person finally caves and says, okay, here's what it is. Then the narcissistic person turns it right back on that person. How could you have done this to me today? Victim. So enough of you have been there. I thought that sequence kind of captured that so perfectly. So Caroline comes to the funeral, right? So Roman and Shiv and Kendall, people often ask me, what happens when a person has two narcissistic parents? Ta-da! We see it here. Caroline has ice going through her veins and is so rejecting. Here, her daughter, Shiv, is still the 10-year-old girl who's reaching into her mother. She's trying to show that she's pregnant to her. And her mother gives the usual kind of really cold-blooded response to her. But again, if you ever did wonder when a person has two narcissistic people for parents, it's really the mess that Kendall, Roman, and Shiv are. Maybe without the money, but that's what that does to many people. Not all. Some people really walk around with complex trauma, or you become some variant of narcissism like these three children did. Now, I got to tell you, one of my favorite scenes was the Caroline in the church seeing Carrie, pulling Carrie off out of her back pew, bringing her forward, introducing her to a woman named Sally Ann, and then telling Marcia, who is Logan's widow, telling Marcia that Sally Ann is my Carrie. I found that scene absolutely fascinating, of sort of the strange alliance that got struck by women who at some point actually attempted to love the narcissist. And in fact, they probably had more connective tissue, those four women amongst themselves, than they ever had with Logan. I found that to actually be a really stunning, incredible moment. And that was a bit of my jaw on the ground moment, but I thought it was really, really great. And I think that it was, again, that idea of where are the connections? Those women probably, even though they were getting into something transactional, also did probably have some form of love for him. Let's go to Ewan's speech, though, because I think Ewan's speech, in terms of eulogizing a narcissistic person, really gets at sort of this, it gets at that entire narrative. What do we see with Logan? Something everyone struggles with in narcissistic relationships. The backstory of Logan, as we all knew in bits and pieces, was a horrific backstory. And there was terrible, terrible trauma, abandonment trauma, and other forms of trauma and abuse. And Logan carrying around this heavy responsibility that he was responsible somehow for killing his sister, being put in the hands of caregivers who had absolutely no capacity to care for him. So you can understand, completely understand, hearing these stories, where Logan's narcissism comes from, where Ewan, his brother's chronic anger kind of comes from. And so what we get then is this narrative arc from Ewan, which I thought actually was spectacularly done in terms of us understanding sort of the roller coaster ride, once again, of what narcissism is. Ewan gives that early poignant story. You can see how struck Logan's kids are, but then Ewan goes right into that meanness. And my favorite thing Ewan said was there was a meagerness about Logan. And I thought that meagerness, that what seems like generosity, but there's an absolute poverty to particularly malignant, grandiose, narcissistic people like Logan. He absolutely nailed it. And I think that in Ewan's speech, it actually laid out for us how you make a Logan and what the sustenance of a Logan looks like. And that he then said, what Ewan said, I'm going to look at my note here. There's a lot happening in that episode. Ewan said something so interesting, which I think captures the experience of many survivors of these relationships. He said, I guess I loved him in my way. Some of you out there loved him in whatever way he would let us. I thought that was very telling, because I think that is very much the sort of the agony of the survivors of these relationships, particularly after a narcissistic person dies, is this person wouldn't even let me in. And so a lot of people blame themselves. Well, maybe it's me, maybe I'm not trying hard enough, but it's really about not being let in. So I thought Ewan's speech to me was a really eloquent kind of, again, the ultimate eulogy for a narcissist, because it laid the whole thing out. So again, we see Roman falls apart as he attempts to do the, we see Roman fall apart as he attempts to do the eulogy. And then we get to Kendall. And Kendall calls his father magnificent and awful. Once again, that dichotomy that captures what people go through in these relationships. They were awestruck by his father. They were awestruck by their father, and he was absolutely wretched to them. Even though this is happening on a grand Shakespearean scale in succession, this right here, to wit, is the experience of people who survive these relationships. I think that the other thing that they got to in these eulogies was this idea, and I believe that this was when Kendall was talking about him, was that he kept you outside, he let you in, the sun shone, it was warm in the light. I got to tell you that, and I think maybe that was what, maybe Shiv said that. Forgot, sorry about that. Kendall or Shiv said that. But that idea that the sun would shine when they were focused on you, I cannot tell you how many films, television shows, writings, and even clients I've talked with over the years would say, when the narcissistic person was on, when my narcissistic parent was on, my narcissistic partner was on and focused on me, it felt like the sun was shining only for me. It is a description I've used, a metaphor I've heard people use so many times, that I think it captures literally this warmth, this moment of attunement and recognition, which is really just luck. And I found it fascinating that they used that in this particular eulogy. With Kendall, after that eulogy, which again was to him, I almost felt like with Kendall, we were watching what he was experiencing as a bit of a coronation, right? He doesn't have the grief Roman has about his father. So he's able to come in there in this more leaderly space, and very, very quickly comes out of there, does what people think is a good job. And immediately, what is he doing? He's trying to create his sort of his kind of band of thieves, as it were. He immediately hits up Hugo, and Hugo has kind of like a little rodent-y feel to him. And he, tries to pull Hugo in, in closer, and Hugo, of course, is always kind of doing this Hugo's always trying to survive, right? Hugo's like that second level of narcissistic supporters, the Gregs, the Hugos, all of these people who are the hangers on, hoping for the sort of scraps. But I have to say that at the end of that, and when they were talking about, even when Shiv was talking with Frank and Carl at the internment, it was this idea of is that what that's called? Burial? Whatever. Yeah, I guess it's called internment. That they were talking about this idea of what you see is what you get. That language also about narcissistic people, we hear it all the time, as though they're just straight shooters. What you see is what you get. I mean, again, it's just a lack of empathy. So they do say whatever they want without accord for how it might affect another person. I think that the Marcia's comment about he broke my heart and he'll break yours too, there is just sort of this awareness of how much harm, the sort of shockwaves. But what you get at this last bit, when they put him in his $5 million former Petco mausoleum thing, that he people are kind of done with him, except Roman. I mean, everyone else is done, but Roman is the one who's not done, which I found a little bit interesting. But okay, we're going to talk about Roman one more time. But again, now Kendall is sort of getting his sense of power. He really, again, he thought it was a coronation. He's turning to Hugo. Hugo's willing to be his subjugated, literally willing to call himself a dog. Then Kendall is also hitting up his former bodyguard. He is Kendall sort of leaning into the Logan-ness of it all, trying to run it like a Logan would. Now we're at the reception, okay? The reception afterwards, and everybody's sniffing around Mencken, the new horrible kind of fascistic president. And now you see Shiv. Now what's interesting is now you have Shiv and Kendall, who are very much acting like their father. And when Kendall puts down Roman and almost mocks his emotion, really goes at him and humiliates him, it literally takes anyone back to how Logan used to regularly mock Roman. It was already Kendall sort of sliding into this role of this person who was going to do that to everyone. But what he has now in Shiv is now Shiv has mobilized her own forces with Lucas, with this President Mencken guy. And now you've got Tom sort of floating back in. Tom's cracks are showing. It's going to be really interesting to see how this all floats out, because I still think that Shiv has some sort of strange, they have almost like a very almost sadistic and masochistic relationship happening at the same time. They're really made for each other, I must say. But let's talk about Roman at the end, because I think this is a big piece of taking Roman's narrative narcissistic arc all the way through. We see a grandiose, cocky Roman at the beginning. We see an absolutely devastated, despair-filled Roman at the funeral. And then during that reception, after Kendall goes at Roman and humiliates him, we see a rage-filled Roman, who actually now this rage was such a self-destructive rage. I'll be frank with you, when I watched that last part of the episode, I actually thought that Roman was going to get killed. I thought that was going to be the cliffhanger, that Roman was going to die, and that we were only going to have Shiv and Kendall left. But he puts himself in a situation where that was very possible, that this was self-destruction, that he was going to put himself in the midst of the protesters, whom he has so much contempt and disgust for, the only people around whom he could feel bigger. He needed to feel big and strong. Remember, there's no emotional regulation for folks like this. It all happens out in this very, I'm going to scream at people, I'm going to say sexually inappropriate things to people, I'm going to wail in public. But there's never that internal soothing mechanism. And so we see him go on this self-destructive kind of rant at the end of the episode and kind of get beaten up literally by the protesters, the way he was getting beaten up by all of this. Again, once again, I don't even know how these people are so brilliant. But again, we have now seen Roman cycle through many stages of great grief, of denial, anger, bargaining, depression. What we haven't seen yet is acceptance. I'm not so sure we will. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. I will say this, it's going to be hard to accept letting this go, because every week I'm like, oh gosh, I don't, they've got someone who knows a hell of a lot about narcissism writing on this show, or maybe it's the people who write who understand this better than anybody else. So again, I hope you all found your little narcissistic bits and pieces in that episode. I am ready for next Sunday night to bring this to a close, because I got to be honest with you, my Sunday nights have become way too depressing. So I look forward to watching something more cheerful. How about some Ted Lasso, right? All right, take good care, everyone. I'll see you next week for our final wrap up of Succession. Good night.